I'm just going to do that, and then I'll edit the first part out.
Okay. So I am delighted to notice that some of you already know our guest speaker today. It doesn't surprise me at all. Although I just had the privilege of meeting Tom Segerstrom last week, he immediately was the first person I was told to go to for this training.
You need to get out more.
As you know, we're going to be talking about the Conservation Gallery today. Specifically, what we wanted to do was to kind of just help us all learn more about conservation, and specifically conservation in Jackson Hole. As you all know, whether you're a docent, a gallery guide, or just someone who lives here and spends time at the museum, a lot of us love the outdoors. And in the museum, there's a reason that the museum is located here. It was very strategic for the National Museum of Wildlife Art to be constructed in Jackson Hole. And a part of that is because so many of our visitors are experiencing nature and wildlife, whether it's through the national parks, the Forest Service, all sorts of ways. So we thought today it would be great to bring a conservation and specifically biology expert here with us. So Tom Segerstrom works for the Jackson Hole Land Trust and has a bachelor's and master's in fish and wildlife management. Is that right? Has worked with all sorts of organizations and private individuals in the area to further kind of the, I don't know how to put it, but the management, the responsible management of wildlife and lands. And so he's going to share a bit with us today.
Thanks. The Land Trust sees a connection here and thought that I should participate as much as I could here. I guess I'm going to stay for a bit of lunch as well. I do have some meetings I have to do this afternoon. I know several of you, but for those of you who don't know me, I'll give a little more structured background. I have a bachelor's and a master's, as Carter said, out of Montana State, and worked for a Forest Service, BLM, U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. Short stint with a coal company, 6 years with Wyoming Game and Fish Department, and started a company here. I didn't start it here, but I moved it here, Jackson, called Great Plains Wildlife Institute, which is now owned by the Science School, and they run that, a wildlife expedition. And then I looked around to see if use a guy like me, and the Land Trust had an opening. So, following my personal adage of take whatever they got and become indispensable, that's what I did. But really that story is the story of a guy who can't hold a job. Lots of different experiences. And I've been in Jackson here since '87 and had to quickly get up to speed about this community and that sort of thing. Spent most of my time in the eastern half of Wyoming and in Montana. But I am in the business now of doing conservation. I've been in the regulatory agencies. I've been in with private consultants, working with industry. Been in education, and the niche that I felt was missing in my background was some on-the-ground conservation that was measurable. Regulatory things, ebb and flow. Education is very ephemeral. You can't tell whether you're reaching somebody today and then tomorrow they forget. All those kinds of things. So for me, that was kind of rounding it out. I was also very familiar with the public lands around the valley. But in trying to understand a landscape and in modern terms of conservation, seeing the whole picture, this rounded me out because this portion of the valley that's private, this is the main chunk of private land. There's a total of 72,000 acres that are private in the valley. I was not familiar with, other than what I supposed were the connections and the ecological flow and function. And this is something we're going to talk about. The purpose here is to hopefully be a resource to you in broadening your understanding of conservation, so that when things happen in the museum, it clicks for you, and you can see a link and a connection, moving people. in that direction. Have any of you had a chance to, I mean, it certainly comes up, and now you've got the conservation gallery, an interpretive moment or whatever where somebody wanted to talk about conservation, or you successfully interpreted something that you knew about, those kinds of efforts. Anything come to mind? Yeah, Susan.
Oh, the reintroduction of wolves comes up frequently, and what that with tourists, they're interested in that.
So the restoration of the species, yeah.
And also the oak painting that we have in, by Tucker Smith in that entrance, that Oak Refuge does bring up that issue of, is this a good way?
Oh, elk feeding and that sort of thing?
Yes.
Mm-hmm. Okay, yep.
And
So biopolitics comes up.
Along with that, one of the new visitors to the valley wanted to know where we put the elk at night.
There's a concept to get around.
It's after they turn into moose.
After they turned into a moose.
Funny one for me. I'll tell you another one. You know, visitors to the valley were my bread and butter, so I try never to make fun of them. But I had a fellow from China and a fellow from Massachusetts, both serious amateur photographers. And we were up by Cody, and there was a pronghorn in the roadway, fences on both sides. We drove on by him, and I said, get ready, and get your cameras and focus on about the fence line, and we'll turn around and go back, but I don't want to disturb him. I'm not going to stop because he'll freak out, and then he'll throw himself into the fence and be bad. So you're going to have to shoot on the move and get ready for this. And you know, the best part about Wyoming is there's no traffic. So I turn the truck around, and I'm videotaping while I'm driving. And I'm watching it, here comes the antelope, and there are my two clients on that side. And the fellow in the back, suddenly, just when he should be taking a picture, takes his camera down and goes, "It's out! He's loose!" And the guy from China goes, "Well, of course, that is the problem." No, guys, he's not just, he wasn't kept in that pasture. He's just moving. But the concept, all the antelope we'd seen before were in, of course, the pasture. So, no, we kept them there. So that's just to lighten it up a little bit here, because I do want to be conversational in this. I don't think I'm going to, you know, really rock your world with new great things that your grandmother didn't already tell you about conservation and how to go about it. But, you know, when we ask, well, what are we talking about when we say conservation? It's really not a fact. Conservation isn't a fact. Conservation is a task. And you do that task over and over and over again through time. It is a mindset of reserving opportunities for future time. It tends to have a longer viewpoint than immediately what do I need. And it can be somewhat contrary to utilitarian types of attitudes or approaches to life of what good is it, what can I use it for. It's a bit different mindset. And it's different from preservation. It's different from wise use. And so this is semantics. But in my world, when we say conservation, we assume it has a connotation that these things are being used and there's a human presence there. You're just doing it in a thoughtful way. And when we look at this community and ranking over comprehensive plans and zoning and all that sort of thing, this community is very industrious, I should say, not industrial, but industrious, very mentally active, very engaged, but we're trying to be thoughtful in the way we go about this, because that is what has made us different than many other communities. We have a rare opportunity in that we have an intact ecology here, roughly. It's functioning at a very high level, and contrary to parts of California or Ohio or whatever, where they're in a degraded ecological function mode already, it's easy for them to do restorations or mitigations because it's kind of functioning, it's kind of dysfunctional anyway. We are at a high functioning area, so a lot of things we do could tend to degrade function. And I'm talking about ecology now. So this community, I think, is desperate to try to do this a little differently than everybody else does so we don't kill the golden goose. You all have gathered that, I'm sure. And we can argue among ourselves, biopolitics or developmental politics or whatever you want to say, about how to do that. At the Land Trust, you know, there's a heritage of conservation here that you're all aware of, starting with Yellowstone, then going to the National Forest, and then out of the National Forest, the creation of other national parks. I don't know if you're all aware of how much anger there was between the Forest Service and the National Park Service at the time the Grand Teton National Monument was formed. But there was a lot, like the Forest Service chopped holes in the floors of the ranger stations so the Park Service couldn't use them. And it was actually in the paper a little bit ago, I think it was 45 years ago today kind of story, and how the Forest Service kind of was sabotaging the Park Service. But that's the heritage here, and then of course there was a private individual and people trying to add to that national park system, the Rockefellers. And then there was the Isaac Walton League. Again, citizens forming a national elk refuge, which eventually the federal government took over, same as the Rockefellers getting the federal government to finally take it over. So there's a role for government, but there's also a role for private individuals. The day of single individuals creating national parks in North America is kind of gone. It is happening in South America. Some of the CEOs from Patagonia, that sort of thing, have bought up huge tracts of lands and are creating a Yellowstone National Park in Chile, I believe. Which is, pardon me?
Doug Johnson's.
Yes, right. But today, we're, as individuals, in the model that's most common or looked to is conservation easements to work with private landowners, because this is already being administered with public views and long-term perspectives, all these federal lands around the outside. And the only thing that affects this whole landscape is zoning and planning. And that can change with a vote of 3 people or an election or whatever. Or it can change with financial resources. Suddenly there's no money to do it, we just don't do it. So what Congress created was a mechanism for private land conservation with incentives involved. You can give tax benefits, etc. And you have to be a certified land trust to be capable of holding these easements in the long term. And so Congress set up this law to work with private landowners. Indeed, our private lands here, as you know because you live in it, are really the connective tissue. We might have organs like the heart of Grand Teton National Park, or the kidneys of the National Elk Refuge, or the arms and legs of the Forest Service. But this is veins, this is connective tissue, this is all the things that enable those to work as a system. And so it's not unimportant. And the private lands were homesteaded because they were the best land. When we are subsistence living, or living off the land as human beings, as the first settlers were, you need exactly the same things that wildlife needs. You need good water, good soil, good grass, less snow, and you need other animals around you. In the human case, you need to shoot them and eat them. So where we homesteaded was largely a reflection of the best habitat. And conservation has gone through an evolution, just like the evolution of art. Initially, if we look at cave drawings, that sort of thing, they're representational illustrations of individual animals or symbols of what was important to them and what they valued, perhaps, and what inspired them. That continued into wildlife art with mostly illustration of individual species. And this is all written in your Darwin gallery material. And then illustrations of animals in action was another evolutionary step. And then a growth for seeing animals in their place, in their habitat and that sort of thing. And then interaction between animals. The hawks and falcon images, the drama of life going on out there, the competition, that sort of thing. I just watched it. When I pulled into the parking lot, there was a rough-legged hawk eating a mouse. That's more likely to get depicted. But our culture and our communities have evolved to understanding systems more. This is the same evolution that conservation has gone through. Initially it was, we got to save this animal or that animal, and we'll put them in zoos and we'll keep them for values of our own. And then it became individual species. We've got to save elk. And elk were on the brink of extinction. You may not know that, but the only elk left in the United States, virtually, I mean, there were Thule elk down in Northern California, a small population. But here in the Jackson Hole area, and southern in Yellowstone, and the Sun River in Montana. And most of the elk throughout the country, New Mexico, wherever you go, all came from Montana and Wyoming. We transplanted them. But there were huge efforts to conserve these individual species. The best known conservation story, of course, in North America is the bison, the buffalo. Every school child knows that story, and or believes they know all of the aspects of that story. So there were efforts, and your other illustration in your conservation gallery of pronghorn, same thing, virtually extinct, brought back. There's a North American system of wildlife management that's been very successful in bringing animals back from the brink of extinction. Everything from wild turkeys to whatever. And artists have played a role in that. Now we're conserving systems, and systems at a resolution that we didn't even think about before. We're thinking about light penetration now. We're thinking about edge effects and fragmentation. I saw the word in your conservation gallery, fragmentation. We, in the latter half of, well, the last 3 decades, it's the evolution of what we call conservation biology. And it's something even the county is working on, of the way we looked at how we valued the system, or what to do and how to build a house appropriately so we save the other resources, is really old school thinking. There's lots of new information that will change the way they're going to look at landscape as people want to build their homes or roads or whatever there is. And it's been a slow, I mean, it's something that you're kind of well aware of. If migration routes suddenly became popular. But with new technologies and more study, getting more and more resolution about how nature works and the mechanisms at play. We didn't know why some animals were prone to be declining. We're learning more. Why? What is it? What little thing are we doing? And it's obviously a little thing because we don't even know what it is. There was just a study that I read last week about, they took an intact forest that isn't fragmented by any roads, and they hung a line of speakers through the middle of it and played traffic noise. Did you see it in the paper?
Yeah.
Yeah, played traffic noise. Animals. You know, you look at Teton Pass here and the noise of that going over. First time I recognized that was on Natalie Goss's place. We were doing an owl survey at night with people, just as a field trip kind of thing, but hooking up with game and fish to do that. And the first year we were out there, we heard, I think 4 or maybe 5 species of owls at night by playing recordings and then listening. It was a successional downgrade through time. We were going to the same place, really nothing had changed that we could perceive. But we could hardly hear because of the traffic noise on the pass above the Trail Creek Range. So these are things that start to creep in after a while about, well, maybe that has some effect. We don't really know. So conservation is evolving. Artwork is evolving. Artists' role in conservation is evolving. We can look back to the Hayden expedition and Thomas Moran and how his paintings inspired Congress to do conservation. It was a pretty easy thing for them to do. There wasn't much going on out here. We can look at how people are moved by your artwork, and the conversation of conservation might come up. What do I do? How do I have some ownership in this? And that's an important role right there. It could be just illustration. It could be engendering the things that we're going to value. The Land Trust was just in work together on a joint project all summer, and now culminating now with the Trio Gallery artists, and getting out. This is something that I toot my own horn. I have some friends that are artists, and oftentimes they would say, "Well, I'm looking for a new location," you know, that sort of thing. And I'm thinking, wow, when I was out on so and so's private land, the view of the river corridor was so different, but it was clear how much of a uniform cathedral forest that is all the way up to the north end of the valley. And that would be a good thing to paint. And they were all excited about that sort of thing. And I pitched it to my boss and I said, that's really a diversion from what we're doing. And it was at the time. But now the time has come to look for ways to relate to people. Are we still relevant to people? And so we did some marketing research in that way. And, you know, a lot of things get conserved because they're beautiful. And there aren't many ways to make something more beautiful to people. One is through an artist's point of view, a capturing of it, and a selection of the elements that really set it off. And they're good at doing that. And the other, in my opinion, is to play music while you're looking at it. And that can really make it even more beautiful. The other part is sharing it with somebody can make it more beautiful. If somebody else revels in the fact that this is really spectacular or special or whatever. And so we've embarked on this. It's been great success. We've had them go out to like 22, that's what there are little numbers here. I just stole this from the gallery, brought it up here. But where their locations were, where they were painting, and the name of that property that they were given access to paint from, and what inspired them when they got there. There's been a link for people. Natalie was at the opening or whatever, and it's gotten a lot of interest from the press. So you've probably heard about it. But what all those artists saw on those properties spoke to a whole different crowd of people than what we were speaking to usually. So, and stimulated conversations that we hadn't had with people. So, the National Museum of Wildlife Art plays into that as well. We're just finished, I'm sorry, I'll quit moving around. We just finished 181 conservation easement up here on East Grove on Butte, extinguished 7 home sites, and a switchbacking road that would have gone straight up the face of the butte with a Great Wall of China kind of set up to keep it from sliding. And that's a big deal for us. And there are 4 or 5 more landowners on down the butte, and we're hoping that this creates a domino effect. The butte is, there's no arguing about the wildlife components of the butte and the value of it as a high functioning location, or what we would call a patch in the valley. Here's a patch, East Grove on Butte. There's another patch, West Grove on Butte. And then what lies in between is commonly referred to in my world, my profession, as the matrix. So it's like you have these lumps of ice cream in a soup bowl with soup in it. And these are kept alive by the connectivity through the matrix. We occupy most of the matrix in this situation. So what we do out here in the matrix affects how well East Grove on Butte is going to function for crucial winter range for mule deer. What we just recently learned about 4 or 5 years ago was that I had no idea. East Grove on Butte is one of the key wintering ranges for sage grouse. Sage grouse being a threatened species and uncertain of how to deal with all of that. These sage grouse that are up in the refuge and up in Grand Teton National Park come down here for the winter all the way down to Dairy Queen. We had no idea. Number one, we weren't going up there in the winter time. It's steeper than all get out. And every once in a while we got a question from people at Spring Creek about what kind of grouse is this. I have grouse in my... And sometimes they send me pictures, but invariably it was rough grouse. Because there's aspens up there and stuff like that. So I always just wrote it off, well, there would be no sage grouse up there. It's way too steep. But there they are. It wasn't until we had better technology, some GPS collars, that we find out where they go. And another piece of the puzzle fits together. As people take their sculpture walk, people look up on that view. That's where the rough-legged hawk was, eating a mouse, right there beside the road. This is really key stuff right behind it. It's privately owned. Nothing's going on there. The people who own it are basically conserving, waiting for whatever their needs are. In the meantime, they're conserving what it is. That's the cheapest kind of conservation, by the way. All the other kinds of conservation gets more expensive. And even the land trust model of a conservation easement, well, it's a complicated thing, but the model relies on somebody living and owning that property, living on it and owning it. We just have an easement. Now, would anyone like me to explain what conservation easements are, the legal constructs behind it? One, anybody else? Essentially, when you buy a piece of land, it comes with a whole bunch of rights. The legal analogy is it's a bundle of sticks, and each stick is a right. The right to build a swimming pool, the right to build a house, the right to walk across it, all these rights. And in Wyoming, it's common to have what we call split estate. You don't own the rights underneath the surface, you just own the surface rights. And mineral law comes into play there. But in Texas, those people say, well, you buy a piece of land in Texas, you own from heaven to hell. All those rights are yours. Each state is a little bit different on how federal lands were involved. Of course, we have a high degree of federal lands, and all the minerals were reserved by the federal government in general. So what happens when we do a conservation easement is the landowner takes out 2 or 3 of the sticks in his bundle and gives them to the land trust, donates them, a charitable donation, and the land trust burns them. They don't exist anymore. Now, physically, you could violate that and just create new rights, but the job of the land trust is to go out there and make sure that the extinguishing of those rights is being upheld. So the landowner still owns the land, still pays the taxes on it, still takes care of it, does all that work, has all those expenses, and the land trust doesn't bother with that. So that's how the model is built. To actually own the land, the land trust has a few fee simple properties, and the costs are too high. We don't want to pay them because we want to use whatever money we can fundraise to do new projects and do more conservation over a larger area. But the conservation easements are like getting a goal, a touchdown. But conservation, again, is not a fact. It's not, that's conserved right there, boom. In fact, it has a space, it's conservation through space and time that costs so much. So in my job, I have to meet with all 126 of these landowners at least once a year, and probably talk to them a couple more times a year, to talk about conservation. We limit it to our easement. We don't go outside the boundaries of that easement. But what do you need to do? What are you working on? What are your plans? And how can we do that with a conservation mindset? So conservation, again, is a task. And with these 26 partners, we have to do it over and over again each day. I think I had 3 landowner requests this week. We have to look at the easement, what does it have to say about it, and if it says, yeah, go ahead, we still try to be a resource, and how would you do it in a conservation mindset? And great, you're going to build a pond, it says, you're allowed to build ponds any way you want. If you want to see wildlife in it, there's certain ways to build a pond. If you want to fish it, there's certain ways to build it would be perpetuate that. And there's oftentimes chemical problems in our ponds because of our groundwater. How could you design around that and let nature fix itself to get what you want? So that's the model, and I've kind of gone off onto the land trust venue here instead of art. But this is pointed to all the time as the great savior that everybody should do conservation easements. They don't do everything. They're not protection or preservation. They are conservation. There will be human occupation there. There will be people living there, and all the things that come with that. It's not quite the way you think of a national park, where everything's supposedly set aside, and their dilemma of allowing people to be there and still trying to conserve it. It's a little bit different. But it is pointed to as one of the most useful tools these days to capture what hasn't already been private or publicly taken under the wing of the umbrella of us taxpayers. In other words, socializing the costs of conservation. But conservation isn't always a loss. I like to point to Carnes Meadow. It was all going to go under conservation easement, but they needed, the town has a desperate situation with stormwater. All goes right into Flat Creek, and Flat Creek is a threatened stream. It had to be repaired within 15 years, back in 1992. Well, it still hasn't been repaired, but still all our stormwater, all our sand, and all that sort of thing goes right into Flat Creek. With the exception of, they created the Carnes Meadow wetland to treat some of the stormwater biologically before it goes into the creek. If we hadn't set that land aside, it wouldn't have been open land to play with, to try to achieve a community goal. So in some ways, you're reserving opportunities to do something in the future, to apply it in a way that might work for public benefit. So a lot of landowners look at it that way. Some of it is I want to get what I want, and I don't want this ever to be built on or whatever it is. Other people do it because I want my children to have it. I want them, the future generations, to enjoy it. I want the wildlife to be able to flow over to the National Wildlife Refuge so that the public can enjoy that. And they got to come through my place. Things like that. For other people, it's an investment strategy. There are financial incentives for doing it. And the attitude or the goal is that you shouldn't have to shoot yourself in the foot in order to do conservation. It's good for everybody. So finding those mechanisms is what is done. We need to go back to art. Now that you have a moral background in conservation. The North American system has been very successful. I need to touch on this. In North America, it's different from the wildlife management systems of Europe, or much of Africa, and that sort of thing. When the Pilgrims got here, pretty early in the game, the colonialists, they had seen the European system, where the king or the crown owns the wildlife. There's all kinds of stories replete, you know, and some peasant with his dog poaches the king's pheasant, and they put him to death, you know, because you couldn't poach. And so this broad-based resource that everybody benefits from was not shared. In the colonies, they generally set up that wildlife was owned by everyone. It's particularly evident in the western states. It's common ownership of wildlife. We've got elk over on the Hardeman Meadows out there by Wilson right now. But I can't go out there and harass them technically. I can't go out and take one. It's not my elk. It's owned by all of you. You own the wildlife. It's been through court cases, one important one which happened right here in Jackson Hole. The Supreme Court has put wildlife into the ownership and stewardship of the state. Each state has their own Department of Natural Resources or Game and Fish or whatever. And then they allocate out privileges to each one of us, a fishing license, a hunting license, whatever it is. And they charge a fee, and they use that money to manage the resource. That's the North American model. That's the role of hunters since the turn of the 19th century, when game laws started coming into effect. The problem that we have with a commonly owned resource is called tragedy of the commons. And many of you might be aware of that essay. But if there's no disadvantage to everybody using it, everybody will just use it a little more and a little more and a little more, and pretty soon it's all falling apart. So some sort of oversight of that works pretty well. Some of you might live in subdivisions, and a subdivision has a homeowners association. And the common story is when they do a development, as long as there's a godfather figure that did the development and oversees and settles little issues here, it works pretty well. Once it goes down to the homeowners association, there's all kinds of ruckus that goes on in between. And the government, in this case, the states usually, plays that godfather figure and kind of settle things out a little bit. But they don't own it either. It's held in trust for all of us, so there's a public trust aspect to it. So this creates a dilemma. If I bring my motorcycle and park it in your front yard and say, don't touch that, that belongs to the public. Well, for crying out loud, it's right here on my sidewalk, you know. I can't get around it, but technically I'm not allowed to touch it. It doesn't belong to me. I have to get a special permission to touch it. So this creates a lot of angst among landowners, among industries, whatever else we're trying to do, this public ownership thing. But it has been the savior of wildlife across the continent. Wild turkeys, pronghorns. I mean, I have a list of species here, but it just goes on and on of everything that was at the brink of extinction. But through common ownership settings, they've been brought back from extinction. What everybody hears about today and what wolves will represent is the Endangered Species Act. Now, that's the federal government getting involved with states. There's some angst between the states and the federal government about that. But when it comes to the migratory bird treaties and the Endangered Species Act, then the federal government gets involved. Takes it out of the hands of the states. States work long and hard to get back into control of that. And that's the story of wolves right now. The state says, hey, we can manage it, just trust us. We've been doing this for 100 years. And the federal government eventually says, okay, we'll trust you. And we're seeing now how that works out. It kind of sets some sideboards on it. But generally, it's the state, in your state, that allocates out those privileges. So the artist's role is really to bring other dimensions into those wildlife values or those conservation values. Artists have a way of crystallizing things that we can relate to personally or are inspired by. And it stimulates thinking about these resources, which happen to be held in common ownership. And it gets us thinking about some of those values, like I said, are beauty. It's just beautiful. Why wouldn't you conserve it? Why wouldn't you keep it around? So with that, I mean, you can see that conservation is changing through time. Now we're trying to preserve systems rather than individual animals. Artists are pitting, because the public has become more knowledgeable about animals in a certain way. Inserting those animals sometimes not as the main subject, but as a serendipitous thing in a landscape painting. And that plays an important role for our minds and how we see the world. There is a disconnect. As our culture gets more and more urbanized, we're away from wildlife and animals more and more. What that does is it frees us to imagine them to be any way we want. When I had my company, we used to do joint trips with the National Museum of Wildlife Art with wolves and bears, large carnivores trips. And we'd come here, we'd look at the artwork, how we depict them. We'd do some readings from Carl Rungus when he encountered large carnivores or whatever. And then we'd go into Yellowstone for 2 days and look at what are they really like? How do we really see them? You know, and in those days in the exhibit there were a lot of fang-bearing and ominous things about wolves and bears. When we went out there and spent time with them, they really didn't seem, they were pretty busy doing what they do and had little to do with us. So there's an evolution in that way, but it is a motivation to be in this area and understand it better. I don't quite know how to bolster your ability to give that to people beyond what I've just said. So my thinking was, I used that most of the time.
No, I think
Surprise.
I think
Was to go to the gallery, see what thoughts you have, see if there's any questions that I could answer that would help you interpret what people are seeing. Is that the goal?
Yeah, I think that's great, and I think we
just
still have
flip
time.
over there?
Mm-hmm.
And then I'm going to stay for lunch, which starts in 6 minutes, is that right?
No, this is
You're on your own
scheduled,
schedule?
this is scheduled to end by 12:30, so
Okay.
we're good.
Yeah, here.
In your wildlife life, is there a effect of the wolves pushing the coyotes south?
It's not so much of pushing around. You also hear this with elk. Elk used to be out there in the prairies, and then when we came, we pushed them up into the mountains. In fact, with elk and coyotes, they are across the landscape, and what it does is cause holes to be cut in their distribution. Where there are wolves, we don't necessarily have coyotes, or the coyotes change their behavior quite a bit because they're avoiding their next biggest competitor. The interesting part is wolves don't seem to care about red fox at all, and coyotes beat up on red fox. So we've seen this increase in red fox in the valley for a couple of different reasons. It's not all about wolves. But when I got here in '87, I think in '88 I recorded the first fox sighting that I'd seen. I'd come from eastern Wyoming where they're very common. And it was up in the Buffalo Valley. I hadn't seen one here for a year and a half, and I saw one, and I never saw one since then. And now recently, in the last 8 years, suddenly they're everywhere. That's probably because we've blown holes in the coyote population. Wolves and humans with dogs displaces coyotes. They'll fight to keep their space. They're very territorial. And they fight among each other to keep their space. But when you blow holes in it, and this has been done in studies in Massachusetts, etc., that the foxes exist in between the coyote territories.
Well,
Does
within
that help?
the last 20 years, I had seen one coyote in the over at in the Wilson area. Within the last week, I've seen a coyote 3 times, and no fox.
No fox.
And so I wonder why.
Somebody has displaced somebody else. There was quite a productive fox family there at the Harbin Barns and in the whole neighborhood. If the coyotes have been able to move in there, they are displacing those foxes.
Well, we used to see
That may be what you're seeing.
We've seen a lot of fox in this scope of patent edition. In the last year and a half, not very many.
Not very many.
That we're now seeing that coyote.
And I have a place in Bondurant, and I used to hear coyotes howling all the time. And since the wolves have been pioneered down in that area, they just shut up. I heard them again this summer. I was hearing in the fall through the hunting season. I was hearing the coyotes howl. But there was a space in time there where, for 4 or 5 years, the coyotes were like gone. And as everyone knows, that's in the predator zone out there, and there's been a lot of wolves removed out of that area. I'm not sure the status of those packs, but they're probably weekly hanging on. And it's possible that the coyotes are coming back. I mean, you just have indicators of that. But being a wildlife biologist is like being in the stock market. You collect all the data you can get about how to invest, but it's a chaotic system. It's always changing, and everything's interrelated, and that's just the way ecology is. So you collect all the scientific information you can. But an investor that has seen many different cycles and many different permutations of things, it becomes an art of intuition and speculation and all these things. Ecology and trying to work with ecology is much the same way. There are biologists that are very good artists and are perceptive to these things, like Harry's noticing. Others that aren't, and they're just going by the facts. You know, but if you can't show me the facts, if you can't prove it with facts, then or numbers, then we can't really show what's going on. So that's a little insight into my long answer, sorry. Maybe more than you needed. But yeah, these changes are going on, and you're perceptive to pick up on them.
Well, he's a lively coyote, I'll tell you that.
And it should pick up now. You know, mating season's going to be February, and that's when the peak of howling is going to occur. And that howling is territorial spacing. So when you hear a group yip howl, very chaotic, and then ends abruptly, that's when you need to listen. As soon as it ends, listen really closely, and you'll hear another pack answer. And in between, there's somewhere between this pack and that pack, there's a line, and they don't cross that line. And we did one of those surveys using volunteers. Some of you might have even participated in that. A coyote group yip howling surveys across the whole valley here. And I can't remember the numbers now, that was in the 90s, but we quickly did it in 2 winters with double-blind tests and that sort of thing before wolves were reintroduced, because we knew it would probably start to shift that coyote population. And we identified probable territories just by people listening, which direction it was coming from, as they wrote down there. It's a system, and it's very chaotic, always changing.
So have they studied